Welcome, everybody, to another riveting Saturday sermon here at Fifth Element Free Church. I am Jessica, one of the trustees over here at Fifth Element, and with us today we have the incredible Lindsay. She's the director of the Burrow Ministry. Are you in South Carolina?
North.
North, God dang it. Oh,
Yep.
50-50.
Not 50-50,
I know. We've been working with somebody in South Carolina all week, so that's been in my head. So, all right. From North Carolina, she is doing amazing things. And she actually, last June, I think it was when you did your last sermon for us, and we were talking a lot. I remember learning some absolutely fascinating things about the diaphragm from
Yeah.
you, and that I have been practicing yoga incorrectly, basically for the last 20 years. So that was super helpful for that. No, but you're full of like really amazing information. And so when we talked about setting up the sermon again for this month, your suggestion, which I thought was a wonderful one, was let's just pick up where we left off last time and kind of revisit this whole idea of our divine blueprint for movement. So with that said, I'm going to let you take it away.
Yeah. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to be able to deliver a sermon again today. And I think the the overall intention here is going to be that we do what most of the time doesn't happen in sermons, which is actually move, like outside of like maybe a little bit of swaying, right? Generally, when people are in a sermon, they are sitting still. And I really want to invite all of you to actually feel within you that you have this beautiful divine essence. Like you are one of divinity. You are one of completeness. You are one of wholeness. And in this wholeness, you are more movement than stillness, and you are more space than matter. And with all of the space between each one of your cells and within each of your cells, there is constant movement that is happening. And for some reason, we don't live our lives as if that was the case. And, back to the last sermon where you're talking about utilizing breath in order to like bring us healthier oxygenated blood throughout our whole body. My intention for today is to utilize movement to allow us to return to our actual divine blueprint. So each of us came into the world in whatever way we came with this blueprint in our mind for the way that we would develop into bipedal creatures, meaning on 2 feet, creatures who could ambulate around and live our lives. And instead, most of us do this all day and spend our lives here. We spend our lives in this way because this is how we make money, and this is how we make friends, and this is how we pay our bills. And like our existence in general is just so stagnant in the way that we're moving. And my original understanding of, okay, this is actually how we were all designed to move. And one of the constants of, I work with patients, and I have for this month is actually 13 years that I've been in practice, in my chiropractic practice. And one of the constants that has remained true throughout all 13 years of my practice, because a lot of things have changed, and a lot of the ways that I address different injuries or issues with patients has changed and evolved. But one of the things that has stayed the same is kind of the basis for all of the movement that I introduce patients to. And it's not because my ego is like, oh, I'm so smart and this is absolutely the way to do it. It's actually because I completely trust in the divine blueprint that each human was born with for the way to move, and is why this method is really, really, really effective. So what I'm referring to, I learned through dynamic neuromuscular stabilization, which came out of the Prague school, which is where a lot of manual therapy has kind of like gotten its roots. And it's just such a beautiful practice of being able to connect with our original movement pattern. So when we first come into the world, one of the first things that we do is take a breath. And we talked about that in our last sermon. And the way that we take a breath, meaning that the rib cage expands and the whole abdomen expands, the diaphragm lowers, the pelvic floor lowers with it, the diaphragm raises, the pelvic floor raises with it. Well, originally, when we first come into the world, that first breath is short and shallow. And we're breathing up into our chest, actually, the way that most people end up breathing into their chest when they're sitting in their terrible posture, because their diaphragm doesn't have any room to go anywhere. So we're taking these kind of like infantile breaths. But in the first year of life, we actually develop enough upright strength in our diaphragm to bring us to a seated position and to bring us all the way up to a standing position. But the process of that, if we return to the movements that took us from an infant through the first year of life, we can actually develop enough movement and stability simultaneously in our entire body. So we tend to, I would say, egoically think, and this is quite hilarious to me, to think that we know better than our own divine blueprint, right? We are so smart that this is how you should do fill in the blank with any sort of movement, right? That, okay, well, when you do a squat, you have to have your feet like this, and you have to have your toes like this, and you have to have your chest like this, and you do it like this because that's the right way to do it. But actually, we have been gifted through our Creator with an actual blueprint of how it is that we should move. But most of us are entirely too busy and entirely too intent upon making movement happen that we fail to see the beauty that exists in the first year of life. So if you have ever had the wonderful opportunity of witnessing a child in their first year of life who is unencumbered by people instructing them in movement, you will see a divine blueprint at its finest. However, most babies are not left to their own devices in the first year of their life. They are given devices in their first year of life. And so we think that we need to teach a baby how to do tummy time appropriately. And we give them a little boppy pillow and we prop them up in tummy time. And we think that we need to entertain our children. And so we put all sorts of shiny, noisy, terrible things that you step on in the middle of the night for your child to be amused by, forgetting the fact that the way the light shines through a window is absolutely glorious. And the way that the leaves rustle in the wind is just beautiful to behold. And we rob them of those opportunities because we give them things, because we think we have to show them things. And so there's a parent educator, her name was Magda Gerber, and she developed resources for infant educators if you're interested in a truly respectful way of actually raising babies. And a lot of the things that RIE kind of synonymously came to the same conclusions of DNS, which is what I have been educated in. So when I came across Magda Gerber's work, I was like, oh, this is very familiar to me, coming from a completely different lens. Her intention was, we need to respect the autonomy of babies and stop putting them into positions and situations that the babies themselves haven't yet earned. And it's disrespectful to them to do that. So the example so back to what she had said that I think is very, very, very important. Magda Gerber said, be cautious of what you teach a child. You might interrupt what they're learning. And I think that's such a beautiful testament to what it is that's happening within a child's brain and within their body when they're just rolling around on the ground. And, can you imagine being bored? Doesn't that sound lovely as an adult? Don't you want to be bored? Don't you want to just have nothing to do and sit and stare a little bit? Doesn't that sound appealing? And the gift of boredom that we can give to a child is one of the biggest gifts of creativity that we allow them to experience. And when instead we think, oh, they're bored and therefore we have to go and shake something at them, we have to give them something to do, we then rid them of the opportunity to become creative in their boredom, because that space and time that we get of just laying on the ground and looking around and seeing like, oh, I see the light moving just a little bit. I wonder where that's coming from, and allow them the opportunity to wonder, allow them the opportunity for to actually wander with their body. And as they begin to wander around with their body, they feel the effect of the floor pressing into them a little bit differently. And if we stop interrupting what they're learning by trying to teach them things, we will actually allow their divine blueprint to be fully expressed. And this is such a gift that we can give to our children. And it's also really challenging because usually by the time someone hears this message, their children have already gone through this. And there's no getting back that first year of life. And that's a challenge. However, we can actually revisit the first year of life's movement patterns, and in so doing, create those same pathways in our brain that once existed that we put new patterns on top of. And so my invitation today is going to be to get up and move around with me if you would like, and if you're able, because this is such a fun endeavor to kind of revisit what it might have been like for you as a baby. We don't have those cognitive memories of our first year of life, but we can feel what it feels like again to explore movement in this way. And the basis of, people will kind of talk about how humans aren't that impressive because a baby giraffe comes out and they're all wobbly, but they're up on all of their legs and they're running about within moments after being born. And humans are like laying around and not doing anything. But humans have huge amount of brain development that happens in utero that then they come out with actually like a ton happening in their brain for the capacity for cognition. And our diaphragm itself is actually what gets strengthened in the first year of life. The other difference between humans and other mammals is that we are the only mammals who have completely our diaphragm on top of our pelvic floor, because other mammals have somewhat of a forward tilt. So like if we're looking at apes and gorillas, we see a slight forward tilt where their pelvis and not their pelvic floor is underneath of their torso. And so they don't have quite all of their diaphragm on top of their pelvic floor the way that we do, which actually makes uprighting a completely bipedal creature with an upright torso a little bit more challenging than any other of our mammal counterparts. So other mammals, their diaphragm and pelvic floor are parallel, like ours are, except for in a horizontal plane. So they have different forces acting upon them completely differently. So when humans first come out, I would invite you, if you are able, to find yourself a spot on the floor with a little bit of room to maneuver. And Jess, I am going to ask you if it is, if you can still hear me if I'm down here. Does this sound okay? Thumbs up?
Yeah, thumbs up.
All right. So when you're a baby, your rib cage is actually arched upward. Your pelvis is arched downward. And so you have this arch shape in your back. Your thumbs are tucked into your fists and you are chest breathing pretty rapidly. So if you'd like to chest breathe rapidly, you notice that doing so can upregulate your autonomic nervous system. We talked about this a little bit in the last sermon that I did. And I'm just going to bring this a little bit closer so that I can still see you. And when we are in this position, it can cause us to almost feel a little bit stressed out. And you can imagine that a newborn baby was probably a little bit stressed out. You were probably a little bit stressed out when you were a newborn baby because you were taking these shallow breaths and your rib cage is all flared up and your pelvis is down here and your feet, you don't yet have control of what your body is doing. And then over the course of the first 6 weeks of your life, you actually begin to lengthen your spine and to have your thumbs come outside of your fists. So this is something that we see around 6 weeks of life, that now we actually can sort of begin to utilize our full open hand instead of having our fists with our thumbs inside. We can also begin to look really easily in both directions. So before that, we kind of had one side that we preferred, and it was most likely whichever side it was that we were in utero. We were hanging out like this within the womb, most likely in an upside down position. And so when we come out, we begin thumbs inside the fist, head turned to one direction. And we have the ability to look the other way, but it's just much easier. And we have a side that we prefer for the first 6 weeks. Then at 6 weeks, our thumbs are out, our head is midline, and we're more actively looking side to side. Then from 6 weeks to 12 weeks, we'll actually be able to start bringing our legs up a little bit intentionally. And you notice if you do this, that you begin to feel a little bit of activity in your abdominal wall. And so when I'm talking about the abdominal wall, I'm talking just about the front part of your belly, the side parts of your belly, and the back of you, which is actually the back part of your belly. And if you were to be in tummy time, then you would be on your belly, and you'd start between 6 weeks, you begin to pick your head up a little bit, look around, you get kind of tired, and you put your head back down again. And then by the time that you are 3 months old, you would have nice, stable position on your forearms and be able to lift your head and look fully around. And this is the very first time that your diaphragm has actually uprighted itself to begin to give your body stabilization. So this was the first initial part of your diaphragm being upright. So when you're a 3-month-old baby, your diaphragm was strong enough that you could still breathe after bringing it to an upright position. So if you don't remember those things, then I'm going to remind you to just go back and revisit the last sermon that I did all about the diaphragm and breathing. But from 3 months, we're in this position. And then at 4.5 months, something really cool happens in a child where they can begin to cross the midline of their body on purpose. And so if you have children, what you saw around this time of them in their infancy was that they could begin to grasp things in the middle. And so they could grab a hold of a toy or, hold their own bottle even, because their brain got a connection from their right hemisphere to their left hemisphere. And they could actually begin to cross the midline of their body intentionally. This also is the same time when they can differentiate what their limbs are doing. So they have a difference between, okay, both my arms are doing this. Now intentionally, one arm can do this and one arm can do that. I can cross the middle and I can differentiate. One leg can go this way while the other leg stays this way, but they're not upright yet. So it looks like this. They can be in this, you can sort of see, they can be in this position and start looking around for toys and playing with things. And this is all because their brain has created connection from one side of their body to the other. When they are about 5 months old, they can begin to roll to their side. They don't go further than that, but they can lay on their side and they'll hang out here for a good long while. And ideally, they would also roll to their other side. I know you can't hear me when I turn over there, so break dance move, roll to their other side. And when they're laying on their side, they begin to get information about the outside of their shoulder, about the outside of their hip. And they actually use that to inform them how they should create those joints. Because if you've ever held a baby, they're pretty squishy. That's the scientific term for that. They're squishy, but they are not completely solidified. Their joints are actually not yet fully formed. So as they're moving around, their brain gets proprioception, which is your awareness of where you are in space. If you ever thought that there were only 5 senses, in addition to the 6th sense of being able to know things that you're not supposed to know, right? Because we are actually all part of one consciousness. There is also your sense of where you are in space, which is your proprioception. There is also the sense that you have inside of your body, which is your interoception. There's also your sense of equilibrium, which is your sense of balance. So you have a lot more senses than 5. I don't know why we've dumbed it down, other than the fact that we seem to have dumbed down just about everything, collectively speaking. Anyway, I digress. On their side, the baby is getting proprioceptive information about their shoulder, about their hip. And then when they begin to initiate movement out of those positions, they are getting muscle pull that physically forms the joints themselves. So the hip joint and the shoulder joint are both a ball and socket joint. And so those joints they have lots of muscles that cross over the joint. And if the joint is situated in such a way that it is not like centered in the joint and it gets more pull and more activity in one way, then the joint itself, so we'll just talk about the hip joint. Let's say that a baby only rolls to their right side because the way that their changing table is set up encourages that they only roll to the right side. Well, then they will actually form their hip joint differently on the right than they will on the left because they're not getting as much muscular input. So there's something called Wolff's Law, which says that soft tissue dictates hard tissue. So we're talking about soft tissue, we're talking about muscles, ligaments, tendons. And when we're talking about hard tissue, we're talking about bones. So, and also when we're talking about soft tissue, we're also referring to vessels. So you have like little indentations in your bones where blood vessels run. And that's kind of like, if you're thinking about how the Grand Canyon was formed, water was cutting through rock. Our soft tissues can actually create the shape of bones. So your baby in their first year of life is actually creating the shape of their hips. So if you, as an adult, have, for example, one foot that turns out more than the other foot does, then that's probably because of what you did or didn't do in the first year of your life. So ideally, a baby would be hanging out equally on both sides so that they're learning about everything that's going on within their body. And then when they get to 6 months old, they'll actually be able to roll all the way over onto their stomach. Now, it's easier for a baby in the first year of life to go from their back to their stomach than it is for them to go from their stomach to their back. And that is because we are predators and we have eyes on the front of our head instead of eyes on the side of our head. Like most animals who you would identify as being prey or other animals, we have eyes on the front of our head. We do not have eyes on the back of our head, except for those of us who are parents and or teachers. Eyes on the back of your head would make it a lot easier to roll backward, but it's much easier for a baby to go to go from being on their back. And when they're 6 months old, they'll actually be able to grab their feet. So you might recognize this as your happy baby position in yoga. And it's a really great position to be in for your pelvic floor and your diaphragm working together. It's also just great for hip mobility in general, but they can hang out on their back and then fairly easily roll on to their stomach. I've run out of the camera space. Onto their stomach. So when they're 6 months old, they'll actually be able to put their arms all the way up and you can't quite see me, and go up onto their knees in this position. And then you'll start to see them rocking back and forth here. Which if you've been playing along thus far and just doing movements with me, you probably are starting to feel pretty good and your blood's pumping a little bit. But moving in this way is not going to actually lead to crawling, but what it does do is give proprioceptive information to the brain about the hip joint. So this is another one of the ways that the baby is simply learning about their body with the movements that they're creating. Excuse me. So when they're 6 months, we expect not that they're crawling and not that they're sitting. And I don't know why those two ideas persist so heavily, but babies do not crawl at 6 months. Babies do not sit at 6 months. They haven't earned those movements yet. And it's actually disrespectful to put them into positions that they have not yet achieved. It's kind of like, Jess, can you do a split?
Not anymore.
Okay. I could put you into a split though, right?
You sure could. Yeah. Yeah.
Now, does that seem like the most respectful way of treating your body? No, not at all. And so if instead of like putting a child into something, now, obviously, like we would probably, overstretch some tissues in you and it could actually be harmful to you. It's not harmful to a baby to sit them. They're not going to tear ligaments or, overstretch muscles, but they don't yet have the stability of keeping themselves upright. So when they're in this 6-month prone position, now their diaphragm is more upright than it was when they were here, where it was only partially upright at 3 months. When they get themselves to this position at 6 months, their diaphragm is more upright. It's not as upright as it is in this position though. So they haven't yet earned the ability to get themselves to this position. So from 6 months, they already have the ability to differentiate, but we'll start to see them bring themselves onto their side. So if we're here for 6 months, we'll come back to the elbow, we can roll onto our side, and we'll see babies at 7.5 months being up on their elbow. So at 5 months, we're here. At 7.5 months, now we're here and we're starting to get the diaphragm and the pelvic floor up a little bit more than we did. By 9 months, we're up in this tall, taller oblique sit position. This, once again, we still have diaphragm higher than pelvic floor and higher than it was before, but we have stability on our hand in order to be able to do that. And one of the things that we see when this position is not mature is that we'll have weight on the outside of the hand. So having pressure along this portion of the hand is less mature of a movement pattern for the brain than having weight across all 5 of the big knuckles. So when we have even distribution across the whole hand, the entire shoulder girdle is more stable. If we have weight on the outside of the hand, we get some asymmetry in that ball and socket joint, and then we don't get as much information about the shoulder itself as we need to fully develop that joint. So sitting in a high oblique sit on one side, or look at these breakdance moves, or on the other side with weight evenly distributed across the entire hand, gives us information about the shoulder. Now from here, because we're significantly stronger and more capable, and we have a higher viewpoint, it will be easier actually for us to then roll back onto our back. This you'll see babies do quite a bit at this age, where they will go from this position, or they can then begin to get into an upright seated position from here. So they'll usually do this transition somewhere between 8 to 10 months. And that would be normal for babies sitting up. The position that I keep getting into here, we refer to as a shin box. Sometimes you'll see babies get in this position from the oblique sit, and then they'll sit upright like this. A lot of adults can't even sit in this position just because it has significant challenges for their hips. But sitting in this position is really, really great for helping to return mobility to the hips and helping to get better mobility in the knees as well. But these positions are part of what it is that we came into the world mapped out for us to move into. So if we're in this kind of oblique sit, we can go from here to hands and knees and back, and we can do that on the other side, but I'm not gonna face the wall. Okay, so we can move to hands and knees, and then once we're in hands and knees, then we can begin crawling. So once again, excuse me, seated and crawling tends to happen between 8 to 10 months, not 6 months. I don't know why we're stuck on crawling at 6 months. However, the American Academy of Pediatrics, if you trust any 3-letter agencies, they have taken crawling off of the list of milestones that your child needs to achieve, which I completely vehemently disagree with, because this is crucial for the development of loading the hips and loading the shoulders. So in this position, we are starting to get 90-degree kind of like perpendicular resistance to our shoulder joints and our hip joints. And when we do that, this gives different muscle pull than what we had in the other positions to help like finish creating the structure of those joints that we will carry with us for the rest of our lives. So once again, if you have some amount of asymmetry of like, oh, my right shoulder does this, but my left shoulder doesn't, it could be because of what you did or didn't do in your first year of life. Now, if you've had an injury, then that can also be a cause for that. Movement discrepancies in general can happen outside of like normal crawling patterns, but even some amount of asymmetry with crawling. So oftentimes we'll see where babies will crawl just like this, or they won't crawl at all and they'll just scoot on their butt. Those babies later in life don't have appropriate hip capsule formation because they didn't have appropriate input in that in the crawling pattern itself. So from crawling, We can also advance crawling a little bit, where instead of being flat on our feet here and moving on our hands and knees, we tuck our toes and then go up into a lower bear position, or push up into a higher bear position and then crawl about. Then from this position, we can push back into a squat, and then we can go from a squatting position up to a standing position, and then very slowly figure out how to take one step at a time in order to move about our lives. So with that, if you want to like rewatch this and sort of just visit each of those movements and kind of think, you know, this is the way that I was meant to move. Nobody taught you how to do any of those movements. Your blueprint that you came here with from your creator is what led you to learning the next movement. It led you to go from rolling to hands and knees. It led you to go into a sitting pattern. It led you to roll to each side. It led you to bring your head up. There was nothing about your input from the world as it is. It actually just came through you when you were born. And so I think if we can utilize these gifts, we can return to more comfortable movement. We can help our children maintain excellent movement, and we can overall have healthier joints and healthier bodies. And I think that's an exercise in gratitude. You know, I came into this world, my soul is encased in this body currently. And if I don't take care of this one body that I have for this one lifetime, I'm not doing my service work, because I'm so grateful that I get to be here, that I get to live, that God gave me this body to have. And Dr. Mark Hyman, he's one of the like kind of original functional medicine doctors. And he was presenting at a conference that I was at. And he said that one of the ways that he encouraged a friend of his who is kind of a mega church pastor up in Cleveland, their whole congregation was just very unhealthy. And they created the Daniel plan based on Daniel from the Bible. Anyway, but what he had said to his pastor friend, and then his pastor kind of passed on to the rest of the church, was, if you believe that God lives inside of you, why are you feeding him crap? Boom. Right? That'll make you second guess your lunch choice. And I think if you believe that God lives inside of you, then why is it that you're not moving in such a way that reflects that, right? Like, I get this one body. I want to take care of it. I want to honor it. I want to be grateful for the fact that I got to drop into this body and maneuver it in such a way that I can be of service in the world. So that is all that I have for today. I thank you for listening and for moving with me. And I hope that you have learned something that you can possibly take into your next week and month, and that you enjoy it and that you feel wonderful doing it. And that is all. Thank you so much. Yay.
Oh my God. I could listen to you talk forever.
I could talk forever, so that's a problem.
You make me think about things that I completely take for granted. I swear to, I was like writing down questions like as you were talking, because I'm like,
feel free. I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah. So the biggest question that I have honestly is why, I mean, and maybe I don't know if there's if this is like an easy answer, but do you have any insight as to why some babies just simply skip over things, or why they do things, yeah. I was going to say incorrectly, but I guess, not in line with the blueprint, right? Because as you were going through all of these, I have 4 kids. My oldest is 17, my youngest is 6. And so I've been through all of those stages many times, and it's fascinating the range that you get, right? For example, one of my kids didn't take his first steps until he was the day he turned 18 months. And they were all over me, he needs occupational therapy, he needs this, he needs that. And I was always, I get that it was on the later end of the spectrum or whatever, but
bell curves have
right. And I was
different
like,
places.
milestones. But the other piece of it was he's my youngest. And so he never really needed to get up and get anything for himself because all he had to do was point and his sisters would be like, oh, you
Yeah.
want this? You want this? Right. So he was just like chilling, like,
Yeah.
but then I had, one of my daughters, she took her first steps at 9 months.
Hmm.
I was like, what is happening? Right. She was like by far the earliest walker. And
Yeah.
I was worried about that because I'm like, I'm not ready, right? Because you see like how much their brains develop, right? Just cognitively, how much they shift during that time that I actually remember having a concern being like, is she smart enough to be walking yet? Right. Like, is this right? Because it's
Yeah. Yeah.
the way that you were explaining it. I'm sitting here being like, oh my God, it's fascinating stuff. But I definitely had, one of my kids didn't crawl at all. And we tried, I tried to encourage him to crawl. He really just like had no interest whatsoever in crawling. One of
Hmm.
them did like the army crawl for a really long time, but never got the legs involved. So yeah, like what I guess what's the
Yeah. So in terms of the different timing of it, like truly there's some people, they're like in the second percentile of weight when they're born, right? And then some people are in the 98th percentile. So the opposite sides of a bell curve exist because there are outliers to that. So 9 months is early, 18 months is late, and that was in perfect divine timing for both of them.
yeah.
So interestingly, the statistics that the prog school has are that by 14 months, 50% of babies are walking.
Really?
And if you think about like every baby that you've ever seen in America, that is way late, right? We won't let children get to a year without trying to walk them, like holding their fingers and trying to walk them.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what I mean. Like we don't respect their timeline enough. And so the fact that you allowed your child to get to 18 months without intervening, that's actually okay. And it's probably best. Like the more time that we can spend crawling, the better. And then even after babies learn to walk, they do still crawl because they're often faster crawling than they are walking.
Yeah.
And then at 9 months, your daughter was just probably a bit more unstable. She probably still has a little bit of like her diaphragm sits more this way in a little bit of an arched position than not. Like she's more prone to have that slight instability. She could have normalized it. It's just more likely when babies walk earlier because you didn't spend as much time like creating enough stability within their abdomen, but she was definitely smart enough to do it because she was doing it. Right.
Yeah.
But so a lot of the work from dynamic neuromuscular stabilization has come, started out with work that Professor Václav Vojta was doing. And so Vojta was working with cerebral palsy babies. And his job was to stretch them, which like you can stretch spastic tissue, but it goes immediately back to what it was. And so CP looks like post-stroke, thumb inside the hand. So if you think about like the infant kind of reflexive pattern that you see, that's what CP looks like. And so the tissues that are shortened are very tight. And so he was kind of like getting in trouble for like communism things. And he was like sentenced to stretch the CP babies. And he was this brilliant neurologist. And what he noticed was that if he pressed on certain reflexive points, that he could actually cause that spasticity to relax. And so there are points within the body that get stimulated in those movements that we just did that cause reflex locomotion. So if you've ever seen the breast crawl, like immediately after a baby's born, even though they can't yet crawl, if you place the baby on the mom's lower abdomen, that baby will crawl to the breast and latch on and begin nursing. And the points like that get stimulated through the infant reflexive patterns, right? So like when we're checking infant reflex patterns, we're testing the sensitivity and the health of the baby's nervous system. And that's like one of the things that I do in practice. Like a new baby comes in and I check all of their infant reflexes. And then the things that happen, right? So there's a reflex called the gallant reflex. Like if you take your finger up a baby's spine on either side of their spine, they'll kind of wiggle like this. It's the cutest reflex in the world, I argue, which no one is arguing that. But like, if you had to argue, I would argue that the gallant reflex is the cutest. That is actually what helps the baby wiggle down the vaginal canal, or what we call the birth canal. But I just like to remind people that it is a vagina. So like, be mindful of what's happening, because you're the one who's in charge of it and not the doctor on the other side of the equation. Anyway, I digress once again.
Your digression.
So the baby will, like, they get stimulated along their, like, just outside their spine, and that helps them wiggle down the birth canal. So when they get laid on the mother's abdomen immediately after birth, they will begin to hit the points that they would hit during their first year of life, which actually stimulates them to crawl up to the breast, even though they cognitively cannot crawl yet, which is really cool, like, thing to just witness happen. So Wojtek noticed that he could create these type of stimulations, and it was causing the spasticity to relax and to actually stay relaxed in a way that stretching could not. And so he worked with these babies, and the CP, like, patients that he was able to work with, they all had better outcomes than what anyone was expecting. Like, CP just kind of looked like CP the rest of their life. And a lot of his patients ended up being able to walk. It wasn't a normal ambulatory pattern, but they had way better outcomes. And so then he kind of, once he was like freed from his sentencing, he was able to like investigate other movement patterns. And he contributed so much to manual therapy but one of his estimations, I swear I'm answering your question. One of his estimations was that 3 out of every 10 babies has some amount of abnormality. And it's not necessarily like all the way to CP, but it's like, oh, when they roll over, they're in an extension pattern instead of like having diaphragm on top of their pelvic floor, that they're more arched. And they just, like, he recognized that those, like, about 30% of all babies had some amount of abnormality. I actually think it might be a little bit higher now, simply because like our world is so filled of toxins, and like the brain is so aggressively like inundated with so many things. Like during the mother's pregnancy, like there's a ton of chemicals that cross into the placenta. And so I think we probably see a bit more abnormality than what he would have seen in this, because this was in, my history is not really good on these dates, but this was, in like the first half of the 20th century into like midway through the 20th century. And so I think that we probably just see, and I see more dysfunction because people bring me their babies because their baby is not moving well. So I see a bit more dysfunction than I see normal function. But I see plenty of babies who move really, really well, and they have their divine blueprint just kind of like expressed through them. That was a very long response to your question.
I love all of it. I mean, it's funny because my mom used to get so mad at me. I would instinctually, like, I just always would put my babies on the floor. Mm-hmm. Like I put a blanket down and I would sit down there with them. And even still, like, I'm a floor sitter. Like I get down on the floor with my kids. We play Legos, right? We do.
Yeah.
People always comment on it. They're like, why do you spend so much time on the floor? And I don't know. I'm like, I don't know. Cause it just feels like the right place to be, right? Like it just feels like that flat surface makes so much more of a difference. And I always resisted when people would be like, here, if you're going to make your baby lie on the floor, like put this big thing over them. And I'd be like, just leave them alone. When you were talking about, the way that a baby, like just looking out the window and seeing how my son, my firstborn, I mean, he was my firstborn, but like the first boy, right? Like, so he was doted on, like you would not believe. This kid had more toys. I mean, it was just absolutely insane. And all he ever wanted to play with during the first year of his life was a plastic water bottle, an empty plastic water bottle. That was literally the only
crinkly noises.
Yep. And I would always just kind of laugh about, like, I'd look at like the mountain of toys in his room collecting dust because he had absolutely no interest in them. But it's so true, right? He just put them on the floor with a couple of plastic water bottles and he was happy. He was so happy.
Yeah.
So simple. That struck me, it really resonated when you said that, like, whatever that quote was, be careful what you teach a baby because you might interrupt what they're learning. I was like, oh my God, yes, right. That makes so much sense. I think it applies even still when we're adults.
Yeah.
I love that. Lindsay, thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
Appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
I'm going to come down and I got, like, one of these days, well, probably in a few years when my kids get a little bit older and I can leave them like
Yeah.
film.
And visit all
I'm literally going to do like a
yeah.
tour around America, like just to come and find all of you guys and be like, all right, work on me. Like, do
Yeah.
things. Like, that'd be so great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. It was
Thank
wonderful
you.
to meet you, and we
Yeah.
will we'll see you again soon.
Okay. Thank you much.
Bye.
Bye.